When you're talking about multiple murder in movies, you're not always talking about the same thing. Serial killing is a very specific thing, and people are very familiar with what that is. Serial killings are done by a single person over a period of time, possibly a very extended one, in which there are multiple murders that bear a relationship to one another, either by the method of death, the style of presentation of the body, or even the type of victim. But serial killers aren't the only multiple killers. Mass murderers, something we think of, I think, primarily when you talk about war. Mass murder is a term that comes up there all the time. But you also see examples throughout recent history, even, of people who just kill a whole lot of people at the same time. The term going postal is the perfect description of that. And then you have spree killers. And Charles Starkweather is probably the best known example of that, and I think people know him largely from the film Badlands, an absolutely extraordinary movie by Terrence Malick that is not only a pretty close to the truth account of the Charles Starkweather murders, but also a really poignant portrait of a kind of American alienation that takes a poisonous turn and sends a young man and his girlfriend on a spree in which they kill some people they wanted to kill and some people who just weren't in the right place at the right time. All of these kinds of killers are completely terrifying. Nobody wants to run across any of them. But serial killers seem to have an almost supernatural aspect to them because the compulsions that drive them are so alien. That's why so often in investigations of serial killings, when people talk to the neighbors say, I would never have thought, what is it that I didn't see that I should have seen about my neighbor Jeffrey Dahmer? And the answer is, I don't know. Sure, there are things that in retrospect seem to be part of a pathology. The fact that he was extremely socially awkward, the fact that he had hobbies that most people would consider unusual, including dissolving animals' corpses so that he could study their bones. But you know what? His answer to why you do this was, I'm interested in bones. People who grow up to become doctors are interested in bones. Archaeologists are interested in bones. Generally speaking, it's so difficult to identify somebody who has the potential to be a serial killer. That is the most terrifying thing of all about serial killers. It's the thing that haunts all those neighbors who found out that that guy 4 houses down the block across the street was murdering boys and burying them in his backyard. Those kind of killings also inspired filmmakers like Fritz Lang as far back as the 30s. I mean, he actually made 2 serial killer movies, which is kind of extraordinary for a filmmaker who was certainly not known for making sensational, horror-oriented stories. M, which was based, again, on a set of real-life murders that took place in Germany, creates a sympathetic serial killer, not sympathetic in that one sympathizes with what he does, but that it's clear that he's an outcast, that on a very fundamental level he doesn't connect with other human beings. And then he later made a film called Wallace City Sleeps that was based on the case of William Hirons, the lipstick killer, and the person for whom we have to thank the phrase, "Stop me before I kill again," although that is not what he lipsticked on a mirror. He lipsticked on it, "Stop me before I kill more." It also goes back to the idea that serial killers are these kind of super killers who are really special, that there's something about them that makes them greater than an ordinary killer. And that's a notion that John Douglas of the FBI has addressed often and quite firmly. He's always said the idolization, the specialization in people's eyes of serial killers is an appalling thing because they're not special. Basically, he described them as horrible people who have nothing better to do with their lives than cut up women. Hannibal Lecter, however, as a fictional creation, is utterly enthralling. Thomas Harris imagined him as a man of great refinement and taste, a man who's very educated. Lecter in movies is always an appealing character. His sly seductiveness, which is something that you see particularly in the Anthony Hopkins interpretation of Lecter, is magnetic. And a man who can maintain what was once dubbed the mask of sanity, the thing that allowed you to not only look at that man or talk to him casually, but to know him and still not know that you were dealing with somebody who had another life, a hidden life, that was appalling beyond words. Thomas Harris didn't create Lecter to be loved. And that's something that he, I think, was not at all happy about. He was not somebody who was looking to create a serial murderer whom people would want to have in their homes. People would say, I'd love to meet that Dr. Lecter, though clearly I wouldn't like to meet him under the wrong circumstances.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Buffalo Bill is a character who represents, first of all, the opposite of the Lecter kind of serial killer. Buffalo Bill's not that smart, but he's also a character who was really very controversial, particularly when the film opened, because he is a character who is on the LGBTQ spectrum, a term that did exist when that book was written and when that film was made, but that was not one that everybody was familiar with. It was one that was much more familiar to people who were within that community itself, rather than people outside that community. And as such, he is now, I think, for many people, a very problematic character. He's an incredibly disturbing character who fulfills a certain stereotype that being on a sexual spectrum that is not the normative heterosexual one means that there's something really wrong with you, something that could easily spiral into being a completely bizarre Baroque serial killer. He's making a woman suit, which is something that goes back to the serial killer Ed Gein. That's exactly what Ed Gein was doing, although by and large, he was robbing graveyards. There's no better or worse when you get to this kind of thing. It's all really, really ghastly and beyond the comprehension of most people. Historically, serial killers are not something that you really hear spoken about until you start looking at the 19th century. I have no doubt but that Thomas Harris was highly familiar with the Ripper case. It was a case that was confounding for the London Police Department. What they understood was people who did violence to each other for what seemed to be logical reasons. Not necessarily good reasons, but logical reasons. As the Ripper killings continued, it became apparent to the London police that they were not looking for the kind of ordinary murderer whom they saw day in and day out. They realized that this was a single individual who was committing murders serially, although they did not coin the term serial murderer, and who was becoming more and more violent as the crimes progressed. The last murder, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, was appalling. The image of her entrails draped over the head of her bed is still utterly, completely horrifying, as is the complete destruction of her body. That's the kind of thing that is the sign of a serial killer at the end of a serial killer cycle, the point that people call decompensation, when they've reached a level where they are really completely out of control. The Ripper case is one in which nobody knows what happened to the Ripper. The London police never caught him. Some people have theorized that he went to America and picked up doing his nasty business there in a country where there was much more room for you to get lost. But that's what makes the Ripper case so incredibly compelling, because you can theorize anything. The number of theories about who the Ripper was, or even what sort of person the Ripper was, how the Ripper might have gotten away, what might have become of him. Or occasionally people suggest her, but not generally, because even when women do commit serial crimes, and there are examples like Eileen Wuornos, they generally don't follow the same kind of progression that men do. I'm not going to offer an opinion as to why that might be. Hannibal Lecter's life extends far beyond Silence of the Lambs. Thomas Harris went back and addressed him in the book Hannibal. Hannibal Lecter was the product of a horrible, horrible background, which is something that you don't know in the first two novels. You know virtually nothing about where Hannibal Lecter came from, what his childhood was like, what made him into the person beneath the person. Certainly one of the places where you really see Hannibal's background being discussed at length is the television series Hannibal, which explores the relationship between Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter before everybody's onto who Hannibal Lecter is. Hannibal Lecter being played by Mads Mikkelsen, an actor who brings an enormous amount of charisma, but an enormous amount of menace to the character as well. In part, I think, because he's extremely large, which is not true of all the actors who have played Lecter. And what he does in his performance in this show, which is really terrific, is sublimate his physical size to the fact that he's an extreme aesthete, that everything he does carefully. And of course, what he does a lot of is cooking, which, well, what can you say? But he does it with extreme care and extreme precision, and the show focuses very closely on the specifics of putting together a rack of lamb so that it stands perfectly, binding up a piece of meat so that it will cook in a certain way. Everything is done with an enormous precision and grace that helps maintain a kind of mystique around Lecter, even as, in that series in particular, the crimes that you know he's committing, because nobody comes to that series not knowing who Hannibal Lecter is, are absolutely bestial and very clearly depicted, far more clearly, actually, certainly, than in the earlier films. Will Graham and Clarice Starling exist as foils to Lecter. They're the people who have the kind of empathy that Lecter has, who have the kind of ability to imagine, if you were in this crime scene, what is it you would have done? And in both cases, you see that it takes a toll on those characters. It takes a far greater toll on Will Graham. Will Graham is the guy who has empathized so deeply that all he wants is to get Lecter out of his head. And Clarice Starling, in particular, comes from an extremely difficult background, a background that prepared her, toughened her to do what she's done with her life, to get into the FBI Academy at Quantico, to complete a very difficult training course, and one that doesn't favor women, and particularly didn't favor women at the time that the novel was written and the first film was made, and equips her to go head-to-head with Hannibal Lecter, whose specialty is messing with other people's heads. And there's a lot in her head to mess with, and he knows it. And yet he develops a certain affection for her, perhaps because he sees that he's talking to somebody who is about as smart as he is, but different in some way that he doesn't find offensive or threatening. Clarice brings a very specific kind of empathy for the victims of Buffalo Bill because she is a woman. And she understands how much women walk through the world aware of the potential that they are going to be the victims of violence at the hands of men. When she goes and looks at the belongings of some of the earlier victims, she has a real empathy that comes from understanding that their belongings represent the kind of women they were. Eventually, that leads her in the right direction. And it's something that other people aren't seeing, specifically that men aren't seeing, because it's something that's so specific to women's lives, to women's concerns, to women's sensibilities. And that's part of what makes Clarice a great character. She is absolutely a feminist character, although I don't think there is ever a moment in any of the films where she says, you know, I'm a feminist and I'm tired of fill in the blank. There are a lot of things that she's tired of. Is not just dealing with things that are intuitive. She's also somebody who's working firmly within the tradition of looking at the forensic evidence, because forensics is very much the basis of most of what criminal investigation is about. Basic forensics count for so much. Forensics that weren't available even before the middle of the 20th century. The sophistication of forensic science is tremendous. That's why there are TV shows all about it, because it's absolutely fascinating. Anybody who's ever watched Law & Order knows that. It's all about gathering up the kind of physical evidence that will tell you things about what kind of person was here, what kind of thing exactly happened in this room. One of the things that's really interesting about the Silence of the Lambs phenomenon is that I think that that is the book and the film that put the word profiler into a larger popular conversation. Profiling is both an art and a science, and that's why some people are extremely good at it, and some people just aren't as good at it. And Lecter is an extraordinary instructor. He is teaching Clarice Starling to be a profiler. He's giving her, bit by bit, the kind of information that she needs to become more than an investigator who goes by the facts and the evidence.
You were telling me the truth back in Baltimore, sir. Please continue now.
Well, I've read the case files, have you? Everything you need to find him is right there in those pages.
And tell me how.
First, principles, Clarice. Simplicity. Read Marcus Aurelius. Of each particular thing, ask, what is it in itself? What is its nature?
Having Lecter be your instructor in profiling is like having Albert Einstein teach you physics. It's not just that he knows pretty much what there is to know about serial killers, but that he is one himself. He's got that tiny piece of the puzzle that the best profiler you could possibly study with isn't going to be able to give you. Part of our obsession with serial killers is that in the 21st century, people don't believe in a lot of the things that people used to scare themselves with. I think it would be hard for you to find somebody who would tell you that they really believed in vampires. Most people don't believe in werewolves. Some people believe in ghosts, but ghosts are generally not on the murder end of the supernatural spectrum. But serial killers are real. We know it because we read newspapers, because we watch television programs that make it very clear to us how real they are. And that's assuming that we're lucky enough not to find out that the guy down the block was a serial killer, the guy that we knew for years. That's a horrifying revelation because what it does is it bursts the bubble that most of us walk through life in. I mean, Ted Bundy, by and large, didn't kill people who were close to him, and most serial killers who have killed somebody who was close to them did it at the beginning. It was because they were the women who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were the girls who weren't wary enough, that when that kind of cute guy with the cast on his arm came up to them and asked if he would help them carry something to his car, said, yeah, sure. Lots of women walked away from that. Some women didn't. That's terrifying because it also requires, especially if you're a woman, that you add one more thing to the things that you're always thinking about that have to do with your personal safety. That kind of caution really does come naturally to women. But that doesn't necessarily protect you from the kind of serial killer who looks like everybody else. The person who's the guy next door, the guy across the street, the guy that you work with. You don't work directly with him, but you see him pretty much every day in the break room. That's a truly terrifying thought, and that is way more scary than a vampire story or a werewolf story because it could happen to you.